right. Good morning, everyone. Is this on? Great. I'm convinced Alex chose me because I have the same name as him, and Alexis was kind enough to honor the same name as well. So I think you're seeing a trend here. I'm Alex Kayyal. It's great to see the SaaS ecosystem alive and kicking in London. I guess the good thing about a venue like this is I don't really need to introduce Salesforce. In case you've been sleeping the last 18 years, I think you know who we are. But Salesforce Ventures, as the name gives us away, we're the strategic investment arm of Salesforce. Been investing for about 8 years now. We have a portfolio of over 200 companies all over the world, really trying to back the next generation of SaaS businesses with the likes of Qubit, NewVoice Media, Onfido here in the UK, and in the US, companies like Twilio, Dropbox, and MuleSoft. Unfortunately, Receipt Bank is not in the portfolio, but absolutely thrilled to be chatting with Alexis, who's gone through some of these challenges. The talk track today of 7 years of trying and failing, I think, will speak volumes of some of the lessons that he's learned building such a successful company in Receipt Bank. So thank you, Alexis, for taking the time to chat with us today.
Alex, I'm delighted to be here. I'm also humbled to be in front of, sitting on this stage and not in the audience. So I hope that I can share something that will be useful. Alex, in his earlier introductions, was talking about generosity, and he was referring to me. And 7 years ago, the number of people who we would ask for advice, and they would willingly volunteer it and add, and maybe you ought to think about this, maybe you thought about that. The generosity of people was quite extraordinary and immensely helpful. I would also say that just asking for advice is one thing. Actually executing it is the fun part. So hopefully I can give you some tips on the mistakes that we made along the way. Would it be interesting, just a bit of background about Receipt Bank? Would that be helpful?
I think that'd be great. I think it's always interesting hearing that story.
Okay, so Receipt Bank was founded about 7 years ago. We are not a banker. Sorry, I'm not a banker, and we aren't a bank. And indeed, nor are we actually in the expenses space, despite the name Receipts. We started in August of 2010. And within about 3 weeks, we realized that actually we were not going to be in the expenses management business, and we created our own category, which is essentially called bookkeeping productivity. So all of the small businesses around the world have got bookkeepers managing their accounts. And so we essentially take care of the receipts, the invoices, the credit notes. Just take a photograph, throw it away. We deal with it, and the bookkeeper then manages it into the account. So bookkeeping productivity is the category that we have created, and by definition, one of the advantages of creating your own category is that you are, by definition, the number one player in that category. So I recommend that to you. So we started 7 years ago. Classic co-founder had a problem with, guess what, his expenses. And we've been trying to solve that problem over the course of the last 7 years. And it's been a remarkable journey. It's been a remarkable journey because every 9 months, as you will know from your own businesses, it's like a video game. You move up a level and you look around and you go, oh, well, we can do this. And you go up another level and you think, oh, we can do this too. And you just kind of keep going. And so that's where we are today. We raised our first $5 million or so through EIS funding here in London. About 60 or so private individuals wrote checks of around about 100,000 each. We then did a $10 million round with Kennet here in London in January of 2016. And we just closed in July of last year, we completed a $50 million round with Insight Venture Partners from New York. And our headcount, as you might expect, has mirrored that investment and that growth. When we were doing the calculations, I think it was the Deloitte's Fast 50 or Fast 100, whatever it was. I never realized just how important the missing 35% was going to be when you're producing a slide like this to make it a nice round 3,000%. But anyway.
Slackers.
Anyway, I'm here during the day. If anyone wants to talk to me directly, please, happy to help.
That's great. Thank you for that introduction, Alexis. And I love the metaphor of the leveling up, and because it's so clear in terms of different challenges that a company faces across that journey. I'm curious, two things that you had said earlier that piqued my interest. One is your decision to kind of bootstrap initially. I think you said the first 3 years you bootstrapped. Just curious kind of what changed once you took on capital. What was that decision process like internally?
So we were too hard on ourselves. We were too hard on ourselves. I said, no, we're not beautiful enough. Nobody's going to fund us. We're not beautiful enough. Could I handle rejection? I don't know. I'm not beautiful enough. And so we We struggled and we scraped and we didn't really know what we were doing. We'd read all about David Scott and we'd read about SaaS metrics and we kind of understood it and we didn't, we did. And the people that we were talking to in the VC community, this is 5 years, 6 years ago, they kind of knew what the terms were, but until an investor has actually had one of his investments with the churn going through the roof, he doesn't really know how important churn is. And 5, 6 years ago, they sure as hell didn't. Now that's, of course, completely different. And so we waited. We tried to make ourselves more beautiful. We tried to make our metrics better. And in many ways, we probably slightly missed the point. So the most important thing, I think, from this morning is not about CAC to LTV. It's important. It's not about, churn, certainly. It's about growth. It's about growth. The number one SaaS metric, the number one thing that people who want to fund your business and see it thrive want is growth and retention. Those are the only two things. Everything else can be fixed. And so we were too hard on ourselves. We had good growth rates. I remember going to one of the larger firms, and as he was walking me out, he said to me, Alexis, he said, the usual courtesy, thank you for coming in. It's like, okay, thank you. Congratulations on the business that you built. Thank you very much. And then he said, very few companies in Europe, only 30 or 40 companies in Europe have done what you've done. Like, really?
Does that make you feel good or bad?
I said, well, actually, it made me feel curious. I had no idea what he was talking about. Because like everybody in this room, you get up in the morning, you grab a shovel, you start digging. You keep digging until whenever. You put your shovel down, you have a shower, you have something to eat, you go to bed, and you get up and do it all over again. I hadn't got time to go wandering around seeing what other people were doing. So I had no context as to what the narrative was. And fundamentally, you are attractive if you have a growth narrative, and if you are retaining your customers. Everything else can be fixed. So we waited too long. We didn't talk to people soon enough, and I regret? I don't regret, but it was certainly harder than it might otherwise have been.
Yeah. So effectively, you kind of changed the mindset as soon as that came in. And I'm curious. You talked about that shift in mindset. You go from kind of looking at a bunch of different metrics to all of a sudden setting growth at all costs.
Yep.
Getting to this number, setting almost this weekly target that you set your team on. Just talk a little bit about that. I mean, first of all, what was that weekly target? How did you get your team to buy into that? And how hard was that, waking up every morning, every week really, and looking at that shovel that you had to go pick up again?
So we had a non-executive director right from the word go, and every month we would go and see him, like two little schoolboys actually. We'd go and see him, and I'd say, well, Alan, I'm terribly sorry. We missed our revenue forecast for the last 4 weeks. We missed, it wasn't very big. I'm talking about 500 quid or 1,000, whatever. And eventually he said, listen guys, he said, just choose a no excuses date. Just a no excuses date. I'm fed up with these excuses. I'm fed up with all of this nonsense. Just choose a date. Doesn't really matter when it is, but pick a date. Pick a date when you're going to start to take yourself seriously as a growth business. We chose, I think, February the 10th, 2011. Valentine's Day seemed inappropriate somehow, but anyway. So we chose a date. And then Michael Wood, my co-founder, had read an article, and it basically said pick a growth rate. Pick a growth rate. If you're going to be a growth business, you need to pick a growth rate. So it's like, okay, well, what feels good? So I thought, okay, well, 3% a week, weekly growth rate. So we've got a starting date, a no excuse start date. This is the moment when we start to take our growth business, seriously. So on February the 10th, 2011, we have a start date.
How big are you at this point?
We're under £1,000 of monthly recurring revenues. We'd had quite a lot of excuses up to that point, Alex. Michael's mostly, I hasten to add. I was responsible for was flawless. So we had the start date and we had a growth rate. And every Monday morning we'd sit down and say, did we hit it? Why not? And we'd try and fix that and we'd move on. But it was literally if you like, that number, whatever it is, 2,900, is built up of, guess what? Lots of Monday mornings at 3%. So, as I was thinking about this, we could. I'm sure Alex would love to delve into the depths of fascinating cohort behaviours and so on. But fundamentally, it was really those two things that actually set us on a path towards taking ourselves seriously as a growth business. And 3% is relatively easy to remember. It's like, did we do it? Did we not do it?
Yeah.
Sadly, we're not doing it right at this moment, so back to the mattresses.
And what was your management team's response? I'm curious. I mean, how big was the company at that point? Did you even have a VP of sales?
No. We had one employee.
Okay, so it was the three of you getting together.
The three of us every morning. Monday morning, we get around the table.
Okay, so quite easy to get buy-in across three people.
Buy-in was easy. Yes.
And then today, I think you've got well of 100 people.
Yeah, we're 330 people.
So how do you keep that growth mindset? From 3 people to 300.
I suppose, as the chief executive, just repeat yourself endlessly, over and over and over again. I mean, one of the things that occurred to me, and in many ways, there's the challenges of growth is that if you do, let's say, a presentation, let's say it's some sort of update and trading update, performance update, and maybe the next month, maybe you add 25 people, 30 people. 10% of the entire company weren't actually there when you delivered it. So as a responsibility, you can look at all kinds of sophisticated channels and Slack and this and that and the other, but actually, as a leadership team, you just have to keep on repeating it until you are bored rigid. Because there's somebody sitting in the audience who is hearing it for the very, very first time, and it's their first time. So be fresh, be excited, but repeat yourself. Don't take anything you said for granted, which is great, because I like to repeat myself and tell stories over and over again.
Well, it's clearly worked. You're on path now to over 25 million of ARR.
Yep.
So, congrats on that phenomenal growth trajectory. I'm curious, I want to unpack something you said earlier, because I think it's very important for what metrics to focus on. You mentioned, growth and retention, everything else you can fix.
Yep.
Just elaborate a little bit. Why do you think that's the case? Because arguably there's at least 6 other metrics one can think, whether it's deal sizing, CAC ratios.
So all of the money that we raised, we raised with dreadful CAC recovery. I mean, dreadful CAC recovery. I mean, like 20 to 30 months CAC recovery. So we're aiming for 12. We were running, and by the way, just be careful about averages, because in certain parts of the world our CAC recovery was really rather good, and in other parts of the world our CAC recovery was even worse than I've just outlined. So just be careful about averages. But that doesn't mean that you can't raise money, and that money gives you the opportunity to fix those problems. And of course, actually, as you're looking for funding, all we're talking about here is your financial efficiency. How much money do you actually need to get in order to get the outcome that you're looking for? So, financial efficiency is rewarded tremendously, because you don't need to raise as much money to achieve the same outcome. But so getting at the very beginning, one of the things, in fact, it's an ongoing thing, is just getting the cohorts structured. I think one of the sponsors, and Alex obviously at the Salesforce, I think one of the other sponsors is in another CRM. Just choosing a CRM that's going to scale with you is an absolute. We did it from day one. As it happens, we are a customer of Salesforce. Possibly one of the best decisions, because we've never had to change. Never had to change. Everything plugs into Salesforce. And so, I had the conversation with my co-founder, Michael, was, Alexis, we need to be on Salesforce. Michael, we don't have any money. Alexis, we need to be on Salesforce. Michael, we don't have any customers. Alexis, we need to be on Salesforce. It's like, okay, whatever. So
I didn't ask him to say this, by the way.
Yes, declaring an interest there. But getting those foundations about your client, your customer behaviors is critical. And we spent about a year on the fascinating subject of CAC attribution. When you got up this morning, you didn't know that at 10 o'clock we were going to be talking about CAC attributions, one of the most gripping subjects in SaaS metrics.
How sexy. I mean, this is why we love...
Stop now, Alexis, stop now.
I think there's a lot of excitement around that.
We thought, this just shows you how ignorant we were, we thought that what we were trying to do, Alex, is we were trying to identify the lowest cost channels that we could invest in. Okay? So you're ready for some important piece of advice. This is possibly the best, which is cheap acquisition channels don't scale. They don't scale. Expensive ones do. So we spent nearly a year trying to carefully allocating each customer to each channel and all the rest of it, trying to identify those channels that we were then going to pile into and invest behind, because those were the lowest cost ones, and that would bring our CAC down. Okay? That's what we thought. It's an average. Well, we were wrong, because all we discovered was, guess what? The inexpensive ones don't scale. The expensive ones do. So the challenge is actually to learn how to do the expensive ones cheaper. That's the challenge. And we spent a year. So I come to you this morning, I give you a year's worth of screw up on a plate. I encourage you not to do the same thing.
The mindset was almost upside down, actually. So
it was completely the wrong way around.
Yeah.
We didn't talk to anybody, we didn't ask anybody, we had no idea what
it is counterintuitive, but until you've gone through it in many ways.
I feel so stupid sitting here, which is why it doesn't say succeeding with Saxton Metrics. This is very careful. The wording has been we debated long and hard on precisely the wording. It is difficult to do this. Financial efficiency is the reward, and financial efficiency is the reward, and that's a prize worth getting, I think.
I love the honesty, because one of the things that's always very hard to see on the outside is that up and down, and I can tell you with 200 plus SaaS companies in our portfolio, it's never a straight line. But when you read about all the success in the press, it seems, so I love the honesty around some of those challenges. And I think on the growth and retention, curious how that, obviously in the early days, I completely agree with you. I mean, growth, some companies don't even have 12, 14 months of history to even figure out what that payback period looks like. Has that, as now you've passed this 25 million mark, your eyes are set on 50 to 100 million, does that start to change from a stage perspective? Because when we look at investing, certainly the later stage the company gets at the BC and above rounds, we start to be a little more maniacal, if you will, on kind of what those metrics look like. Earlier at the seed A and B, certainly growth is a key lever. How does that change internally for you? As you set to 50 and 100 million plus?
So it is the fundamental financial metric. It is the measure of if we're not going to use the balance sheet and the P&L specifically as a driver of value as a financial goal, then we have to place, and the temptation, by the way, is almost overwhelming for non-executive directors, for chairmen to grab for the P&L and use that as the framework for the conversation about the business, which is wrong. And once you've set out on this SaaS path, and once you've set out on a growth trajectory, fundamentally, getting good at doing it, getting good internally at the language of SaaS, and getting good internally at the decision making that is involved in that makes a tremendous difference. I suppose for me, the framework doesn't change, the conversation doesn't change. It becomes more difficult to articulate that to your colleagues, people who perhaps have not lived and breathed SaaS in the way that we all have. So that's a challenge in terms of education. The metrics and the framework, the data framework stays the same. You're just bringing in people who have got just a lot more experience in doing it. So in July of last year, we were able to bring in a CMO who had been the CMO at Cvent, which is, I think, the world's largest event organizing software business. And I've never seen industrial scale marketing done before. And our CAC has not shifted, despite the fact that our team has gone from probably 8 people to probably nearer 28 people. The CAC metric that we have been running for the last 7 years is exactly the same today as it was 5 years ago. We're just doing it at a much, much, much bigger scale. So the numbers tell you everything you need to know.
And did it go up before coming down?
A little bit. But you can use a rolling average to get directionally correct.
That's the point, right? I think the interesting, you talk about this averages and kind of how you guys obsessed over. It can be very misleading in a business.
Yes.
Maybe share some of the segments that you guys looked at. You talked about geographies being very different. What else, kind of from an average perspective,
Just beware averages. They're always dangerous.
Yeah.
You will delude yourself if you just concentrate on the averages. And ARPA, average revenue per account, is a nice one. I think we're playing around with, well, maybe we should be using, I can't even pronounce it, MARPA, which is, it's not the average, it's the median revenue per account. So just simply trying to get to grips with what does it actually mean, and how can we put it into a framework that we actually do something about. One of the things about large cohorts and averages is it's quite difficult to get a hold of. What can you shape this? And if you're just really focusing on averages, you'll probably find that there's a customer segment that actually the CAC recovery is world class, but you just didn't know it because you were looking at the average.
And I would encourage founders in the room to the earlier, and we should talk about a little bit the infrastructure required to get to the bottom of this, because the earlier you start tracking a lot of these metrics, the sooner you're able to actually start to answer some of these questions. And Interestingly, I think in a lot of SaaS companies today, the segments from a customer perspective, whether it's SMB, mid-market, enterprise, companies are able to serve customers across that spectrum more and more as opposed to just being in one narrow niche. And you'll find very different customer acquisition paybacks, deal sizing across, a Fortune 1000 company versus a 50-person company. And kind of those deal mechanics are very different. Did you have that infrastructure in place?
No, of course not. No, we thought we did. But
like
in the hands of an expert venture capitalist, the layers were peeled back and we were exposed for the naive individuals that we were. We thought we had it. But we really didn't. We didn't really understand that actually you can put your deck together and you can do all the wonderful things like that, and you can talk about the growth rate and everything is great. The first question is going to be, show me your cohorts. Show me the underlying data because I want to unpack all this. And if you're then scrabbling around for 3 weeks, what does it tell the person who wants to invest, and people do want to invest in your business? It tells you that the infrastructure isn't quite as robust. Your decision, the data on which you're basing your decision making isn't as reliable, isn't as useful. I know you fill in the gaps. And sure enough, ours was, guess what? Not as reliable, not as useful, and possibly a little bit misleading. And so we struggled to go back and recast those cohorts. And I would just simply urge you all to take that element, that foundation element, really, really seriously. We're still grappling with it. And despite the fact that we were built on Salesforce and other bits and pieces, it's still a struggle.
And one of the things that made me smile when we first started talking about this session was you talked about, with all the blog posts available today, all the different resources, sometimes you can get lost as a founder on the definitions of even some of these terms. And you kind of talk a little bit about that, because you made a decision in terms of how you do. Good example being, how do you even calculate churn? What's considered a churn event? Churn
is like, well, it's really easy. You had a customer and then you didn't have a customer, right? It's easy. Any idiot knows that. And we were actually reporting, until really quite recently, we were actually reporting our churn as essentially net churn. So we were, just because of the way that the systems had been set up, there was no manipulation involved. I think we've got someone from Insight in the audience. There was no manipulation involved, James. It was entirely accidental. But we were actually reporting churn based on win-backs. So it was net churn. But I didn't know that, because I didn't actually do the plumbing in the first place. And so something that was set up 4 years ago, you really, really have to look at very carefully. Once again, that takes you back to the underlying cohort behaviors. So we're still making mistakes, and you can still discuss when is a customer, when the credit card fails, is that the moment when it happens? Is it maybe 30 days after the credit card? When they've received 3 emails? When do you close the account? There are no right answers. It's difficult. It's challenging. There aren't any right answers, but just remember at the end of the day why you're looking at these numbers, why there is so much, so many articles written about them, and how that helps you with your goal. And I would just also say, you do need to choose a goal. What am I actually trying to achieve? Is it a journey to $100 million, say, of ARR? Is that your journey? It's helpful to have that. If you agree that's kind of like the direction you like to go in, then a lot of the infrastructure decisions get made for you. A lot of the questions become obvious. If you don't have that, then it becomes a bit more problematic. I'm not sure I really answered your question, Alex, but
you did, because effectively, I think the point you're making is ultimately you can spend hours and weeks and months figuring out definitions, or you can just pick one and move on and start to track it. And I think to me, that speaks volumes, because it still surprises me how many companies we meet, frankly, who aren't tracking these things.
Right.
And part of the hassle is figuring out how they should define a lot of the metrics, and ultimately, because they're still in this limbo of figuring this out, they're actually not tracking anything, and they are literally running their business blind. I'm curious, how many people in the room are on the operating side, either running a business or part of a business as opposed to an investor? And keep your hand up if you track any of the metrics that Alexis mentioned today. Okay, great. That's actually impressive. Mm-hmm. So see, there's progress in the ecosystem.
But do they really believe? Are they really believers, Alex? I don't know. I mean, it's very easy to put your hand up. I mean, but do you? Until you felt it moving against you, you don't know. You really don't know.
Alexis is giving a proctology exam at 10:30 after in the back if you'd like to find out. One of the things that really stood out is when you were talking about lessons learned as well was all the things you actually said no to as opposed to all the things you said yes to, which again piqued my interest from a lessons perspective. Just share a little bit more about what you meant and some of the mistakes there.
So it's really easy. We were talking a little bit earlier about, bootstrapping. We want to be loved. Everyone likes to be loved. Everyone wants to be liked. And saying yes is really easy. Saying yes is really easy. And just picking up the introduction that Alex made about, so many people were helpful and generous to us with their experience and their wisdom and their observations, and we tried to implement as much of that in practice. So it's sorry, I just slightly lost my train of thought in terms of the Anyway, so when we won or concluded in the Deloitte's Fast 50, they sent us a postcard, and they said, "What advice would you give to up-and-coming entrepreneurs?" And this card, it was literally 6 lines, it wasn't a big deal. And this card, I was sitting there, my first effort I thought was slightly pompous, comes naturally. The second one I thought was slightly patronizing. It's like, okay, well that's really not working. And then I put it to one side and I thought I just left it there on my desk for 2 weeks. It was sitting there staring at me. And I thought, no. We made a promise 7 years ago that if someone asked for guidance, advice, whatever it was, that we would respond. Not like the fire brigade, but we would reply. And the best that I could do, and what I ended up writing on the envelope, and I think it's got nothing to do with SaaS metrics. Perhaps it's got to do a little bit with prioritization, but fundamentally, the best piece of advice that I wrote on the card, and I think it was good when I wrote it, and I think it's good now, is say no often. Say no often. It forces you to make choices. And if you say yes, you are committing time that you don't have, and by the way, that is the one thing you genuinely don't have, and money that you don't have. So saying no it forces you to choose things to say yes to. And it is just so easy in a small business or indeed a large business when you're being hit with all kinds of opportunities to do this or fix that or change the other, just to say, yes, we're going to do that, yes, we're going to do that, yes, we're going to do that. And the answer is no. The answer is be very careful about the things that you say yes to, because you are making a commitment of time and money, both of which are limited. Time is much more limited than money. You can usually get more money. Time is the one thing you don't have. Difficult to pick that up in a SaaS metric, but is that helpful in terms of no?
I think if we had to kind of summarize some key traits that we see across many successful founders, focus certainly screams as the top of that list.
Quite.
So very helpful here. I'm conscious of time. I have a bunch more questions I'm going to ask Alexis, but are there any burning questions in the audience? I want to make sure you've had the chance. I saw a hand in the back there come up. If you want to just maybe stand up, introduce yourself, and ask your question. Do we have mics going around?
Far away.
Oh, we also have Slido. Right, so okay, great. So you can also ask questions via this great app, and they'll come up here. But why don't we start with you in the meantime?
So attribution is a tremendous. We could devote Alex, we'd like to devote an entire day to attribution in future. So could you? It will be a sellout crowd. You probably have to double the venue because it's such a riveting and gripping subject, and we can delve into it in detail. Attribution is a challenge. There isn't a right answer to it, the premise that because of the sort of ecosystems in which we operate, that somehow that those are not valid, that they're not valid. You've got obviously organics, but we don't get in that respect very many direct referrals. So the more you grow, this was the point I was making about the low-cost acquisition channels. Things like organics and referrals are low cost, but don't scale. So what scales is mini events. So we're doing, in the next 90 days, we're doing 3.5 events every day. That could be a trade show, it could be a webinar, it could be a dinner, it could be a lunch, it could be a breakfast, so globally we're doing near as damn it, 3 to 4 events every day. Guess what? They scale. It's very easy. It costs us about $2,000 to put it on. Typically there are 20 people, conversion rates roughly around about 25-30%. Bingo. Just keep ramping it up. So I would say attribution, just focus on the things you can scale. Referrals, you can't scale. I haven't answered your first question. Why don't we pick it up afterwards? Yeah?
And our 10-second thoughts on that, because it comes up a lot for enterprise versus SMB. I mean, typically, what we think of as best of class is the enterprise space, meaning when you're selling to larger accounts. Anything sub 10% annual gross churn is pretty favorable. On the SMB side, it's gone better over the last few years, as I think a lot of companies have taken advantage of some of this know-how. But it wouldn't be unusual to see kind of 20-30% in the SMB side from an annual churn on a gross basis. Obviously, on a net basis, you want to see that be negative on both sides. Do you want to pick your favorite? There's a couple that have come in.
Oh, billing. Billing's a great one.
People have upvoted.
Alex, another subject on billing. I know you want to get us off. Billing is a fantastic subject. Almost everybody has to write their own billing software and maintain it. It's a pain in the neck. I think Jamie, we're using
one more question.
Financial Force. Yeah, we're implementing Financial Force in the next, but that's 7 years worth of writing our own damn billing thing, and it's a pain. And there's no way out.
The recalling the hardest no has had the most thumbs up. So I'm going to ask you to answer that one as a wrap up. So what was your hardest no you've ever had to say? I think he thought about saying no to showing up to this, but
they're all hard. No, that's why we all say yes. That's why the default position in humanity is to say yes. Every no, because you're disappointing someone. They're asking you to do something, and you say, no, we're not going to do that. No, I know it's, in many ways, actually, there's yes, no, and not today, but, in 6 months' time is also valid. But every no is difficult, because everybody, who has passion and enthusiasm for the cause believes that what they're coming to you, that you want to allocate time and resources to whatever they're proposing. They want it to be funded, and you want to fund it. You want to give them the money. You want to give them the time. So you want to say yes. Every sinew in your body will be saying yes, and I urge you to say no. Every single one of them is difficult.
Well, on that positive note, thank you very much,
Alex. Thank you very much indeed.
Please join me.